So the next thing I want to work on is getting the horse to respond to pressure. Responding to pressure is how we communicate with horses. We apply pressure, the horse responds, we reward the horse. Now in racing, horses don't necessarily respond to pressure the way we need them to respond to pressure in general equestrian riding or riding in any form. What usually happens with racehorses is they respond at one end of the spectrum. One would be they push into pressure and move against it, or they run away from pressure, and neither of them are any good to us when we're trying to train a horse. We need the horse to give us a response to pressure which is reasonable. We apply pressure, the horse responds, he gets rewarded. What I'll often do when I go to look at a horse for the first time is control his nose and apply a bit of pressure on his poll. And how he responds to that pressure on the poll will give you an indication as to how he's going to respond to pressure in general. If he moves easily away from the pressure, that's what I'm after. If he pushes against my hand, chances are he's going to push against pressure all the time. If he panics about my hand being there, then he's obviously sensitive. I'm going to have to be a little bit more careful. So when I work with the horse, whether it's on his body or whether it's with the bit in his mouth or whether it's touching him with the whip, I need him to give me a gentle response to pressure that is acceptable, that's workable for me and for the horse, so that the communication is very clear. Okay, so the first thing I might do is I might place my thumbs in the centre of the horse's chest and ask him to move back off that pressure. Now I want to apply light pressure, and the moment the horse responds, I want him to be rewarded for it. The idea is to give the horse a really easy task that he's going to get an understanding for. And you'll see when the horse starts to get an understanding of what I'm trying to do, he'll start to lick his lips. Swallow the idea if you like, and then I can start to move on. So I might ask him to move his hindquarters off to the left or to the right. I might ask him to move his shoulders. And then I might move to putting the bit in his mouth and getting the correct response from the bit in the horse's mouth. Making sure that he understands when he feels light pressure on the bars of his mouth, that he understands that he needs to respond either left or right. Now for a lot of racehorses, they don't get that sort of technical detail in the way that the bit is handled in a racing situation or in a training situation. But for what we want to do, the horse has to be much more fine-tuned to what happens to the bit in his mouth. So I need to make sure that I can get a nice flexion in the poll from the right and the left with the right sort of contact on the horse's mouth. So what we need to make sure is that when I apply pressure to the horse's mouth, left or right, that he gives us the right response.
Matthew SANDBLOM is well known in Australian racing and breeding circles. Part owner of Newgate Farm, he raced Golden Slipper winner Capitalist and also owns KINGSTAR Farm. Founder of the Mathletics online games for children, Matthew has a wonderful analytical brain, and we were keen to hear from his submission to Thoroughbred Welfare Initiative, a new industry body, about his thoughts on thoroughbred care and welfare in Australia.
Sprinted to the lead inside the last 100.
Matthew, well, I know you're very passionate, as we all are, about making sure that our thoroughbreds, particularly the ones we've bred, find good homes. But I know you've put a submission into the Welfare Initiative. What are some of the main points you think the industry and owners and breeders should be looking at?
I think we need quite a bit more work, and we need a lot more resources put into the rehoming side of things. And I think those funds have to come from each stage of the process. I think from the time you breed horses, I think there should be payments into welfare. Selling horses, all the way along, there needs to be contributions made. Because reality is, rehoming horses is an expensive business. People just think, oh, once I've got the horse placed somewhere, that's it. But there's only so many places, and horses, as we know, when they're in training, they cost a lot of money. But okay, they don't cost quite that much, obviously, when they're in a lot of these post-racing lives, but they need support, and we need to encourage ownership and different groups and sponsor, shows and competitions involving thoroughbreds, and I think we need to also reduce the number of horses we breed, perhaps as well, and make it not too easy to have overpopulation, because the average racehorse is going to live for 25 years naturally. So how much responsibility are we taking for that lifetime of the horse? If we're really going to be serious about it, I think we've got to probably even license breeders, have a number of licenses used each year for breeding, so we can control the numbers. and not always popular views, some of these with some other breeders, but this is where I think we'll eventually get to. Whether or not we get to it in 2 years' time or 5 years' time, I reckon we'll get to this point. And also try and lengthen the life of the racehorse, because make races for older horses, for low level horses. I mean, give people a reason to keep racing them. Otherwise, so many careers are only a few starts, and then suddenly that's it. I mean, it seems like quite a wasteful industry from that point of view. So I think you can both increase the quality of what you're breeding overall, and also then increase the longevity of the racing, and then put more money into welfare.
Where do you think that prize money should come from to continue for the older races?
Well, it's part of a whole industry thing, though. If you had less horses, you would need to race them a bit more anyway. So that would give opportunity. So it's partly about reducing the overall number of horses, so therefore there's less horses in training at any one time, but they're racing more. Too many horses just becoming wastage in terms of they're not suitable for racing, and suddenly then we have to find subsequent uses for them, and that's not unlimited. There's not as many people riding as there was once. There's not as many people on farms as there was once. I mean, the average career of a racehorse is probably less than 2 years. If you look at the average, from the time they start in a stable to the time they leave racing, because most of them can't pay their way under the current system.
Have you looked at some of the models around the world? I know in South Africa there's sort of a retirement fund basically, so you have to put aside whatever the $1,000 odd or several $1,000s that will go to that fund, because as we know it does take some thousands of dollars to get these horses retrained properly.
Yeah, well, that's what I put in my submission, saying that each stage you need a breeding license for $1,000 and you need a registration license. Considering there's about 10 to 12,000 horses a year being bred, and $1,000 per horse equals about $10 million. You could build up $40 or $50 million going into this welfare fund, and some of that money even might go to sponsoring races for horses of older ages as well, to keep them in training longer. It means increasing the amount put into welfare by 2 or 3 times what we are now.
There's a lot of work being done to try and encourage the take-up of thoroughbreds away from racing. It is hard to find people to just kind of do it for free.
Yeah, there's a lot of passionate people involved in horses, not just in racing, and they love their horses, but at the same time, horses are expensive things to keep. But like with racing, people only need a bit of encouragement and they will put more into it. But you got I suppose in racing the encouragement is prize money and winning big races. But even then, if you look at how much money people put in versus how much money they get out, there's a big gap still. So equally, I think with a lot of horse people outside of racing, they realise they're not, it's expensive, but if it could be a bit less expensive by, giving subsidies to rehoming and retraining them, or even having farms which look after horses when they're not otherwise, placed anywhere. So you can give helping hands without paying for the full freight of what it really costs to keep horses.
Is it possible to rehome all of them?
I think if you breed less eventually, and that's probably where we need to get to within maybe a decade, where the supply and demand of both racing and racehorses and the amount of racing and also later on the rehoming is basically more or less in balance, because I think it's probably already amongst a lot of the community unacceptable to slaughter horses. The racing people don't believe that on the whole, but I think public pressure will eventually come to bear where it won't be acceptable. And besides, horses which need to be humanely put down for injuries and illness, it won't be acceptable. But I think breeding a higher quality overall is a good thing. Breeding more sound horses, more well-conformed horses, because generally speaking, better physicals will race longer and have healthier lives and less injuries. So it all feeds into the welfare story. Currently there's no licensing for breeders, so there's probably people coming into the industry making a lot of really basic mistakes with their breeding, and then being really disappointed by the sales results they get. So it's going to cost them anyway if they come in and do, poor level breeding. I mean, it's a very expensive thing to do breeding and keep these horses. So actually having a bit of a barrier, obstacle, saying, before you launch in to do this, you might not realise it's going to cost you quite a lot of money, and you might as well, should learn basics about the industry, the business of the industry, the economics of the industry, and make sure that you want to be in that, and have the experience to understand the dynamic, what's driving the industry, so that yes, it might cost you a little bit more at first, but it'll save you a lot, because you'll be a bit more informed, and you won't go and buy that bad-legged mare who's uncommercial, who's isn't really a strong prospect, because you remember the grandmother when it raced at Randwick once and you backed her or something, you know. You'll be a bit more hard-nosed about it, which you have to be, otherwise you just go broke. And if you go broke, you get out of the industry. Absolutely. So you want to keep people in the industry longer. You want people better informed, better trained, and more knowledgeable. There's already registrations and licensing to do with breeding dogs. We've gone from being, seen as an agricultural industry to being more of a, domestic animal. So we have to then start applying more of those rules than more rules that apply to dogs than the rules that apply to cattle.
Yeah. And what's been the feedback? I'm sure you've had discussions, with different people in the industry. What's the feeling? I mean, no one likes any sort of change, do they?
No. And look, basically, a lot of studs are sort of like they are farms, and people who run them are farmers in many ways, and farmers tend to think a certain way about livestock. So I think in the general public now they don't see racing in the same way. They see horses more closer to being domestic animals than being agricultural animals. Because everyone says, we love our animals and we treat them so well, but they don't say the second half of that sentence will be until they finish their racing career, and then that's not our responsibility. So if you really love the animals, you've got to follow through and say what happens to them after their racing career, and how much responsibility are we going to take as an industry for that.
Plenty of food for thought there, and it will be interesting to see the next steps taken by Thoroughbred Welfare Initiative in Australia. Coming up on Thoroughbreds Are Go, another tale of thoroughbred love in Arrowfield Studs' Strappers Stories.